let's go back to January 6th,
Right.
2021, and you get a phone call.
Right. Mr. Gene Collins, he was my Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army over training and Guard and Reserve Affairs. And he came in and he said, Dr. Wardynski, there's something going on at the Capitol. Can I use a secure VTC machine down in Mr. Williams' office? And I
Which
said, well, sure.
VTC machine is?
Video teleconference.
Okay.
But they're secure. This isn't just like mom and pop are going to chime in. It's not a Zoom.
Right, it's not a Zoom at all.
And so he got it running, and I walked down there. It was, most of us had already signed our resignations, which were effective noon on Inauguration Day.
Mm-hmm.
And so there wasn't a lot going on in the Pentagon. And I went down, and what I see is General Walker over in the Armory for the Guard, and then on the other side is the Chief of Staff of the Army, the G3, which is the Chief Operating Officer of the Army, and the Director of the Army Staff, who sort of synchronizes things between the Secretariat, the Secretary and the Assistant Secretaries, and the Army Staff.
So these Pentagon guys, we're talking about, what, 4-star and a couple 3 stars?
4-star and 3 stars.
All right.
These are senior people.
So you're on the call. You've got a 4-star.
I'm on the call by
3-star.
accident.
By accident.
Yes.
And then you've got General Walker from
the Guard. Right.
All right. So at this point, it's already quite some time after the United States Capitol Police Chief, Stephen Son, had already been calling up the alarm and saying, we need you, we need you, we need you. Now, at this point, over at the Capitol, he's talking to the sergeants at arms. He's talking to the House Sergeant of Arms, and he's saying, I've got to run it up the chain. So when he says run it up the chain, was that through Pelosi? Because that was always my initial reaction.
Right. I think he had a police board over him.
Right.
And they needed them to vote and then make a request.
Board,
and then ultimately, of course, they're going to do what the Speaker wants and the Majority Leader wants. So ultimately, it probably was waiting for a decision from those folks.
But we heard back in the news not very many weeks later that it had been reported, and we assumed that this also came from Pelosi through her Sergeant at Arms, was that there was this notion of they didn't like the optics. So we thought that phrase came from Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House at the time itself. But
she probably heard it from Milley first. I tell you, these Army guys at the top, Milley, McConville, and these folks were always worried about optics, particularly if it was a way to sort of migrate their military expertise into a non-military matter. January 6th was a political matter, right? And they're asserting, my best military advice is we don't think it looks good for Army soldiers to be standing in front of the Capitol. That was it.
So what's
that's
happening?
Not military advice, that's political advice.
So what's happening on this VTC call that led to that discussion about the optics? I mean, obviously, you're getting a panic phone call from Chief Sund. Maybe it's not coming directly from him, maybe it's coming through the Sergeant at Arms, but nevertheless, somebody got the phone call and said, we need the Guard here and we need them now.
Right. Well, General Walker had good relations with everybody in Washington because he knew, he was their guard, right? So he would reasonably be talking to Sund, the Metropolitan Police Department, which normally would deputize the Guard so they could act in a law enforcement role, whereas active Army can't. The Guard can, and they just get deputized by the local police or the sheriff or whatever, and now they can assist law enforcement in law enforcement activities, which is great. It's not a military thing, it's law enforcement. So he'd be talking to these kind of guys, and my recollection from talking to him was that was the case. He was hearing from them that things were out of control at the Capitol. They needed his help pronto.
But pronto didn't happen.
And he fully expected pronto to happen, but it did not happen.
And why is that related to that call?
Well, that call really had no conclusion to it. It was back and forth. General Walker's on the other end, and he was busy as hell with phones and radios, getting reports. In the background, somewhere in the midst of that, I think that was about a 40-minute call. You can hear in the background his deputy saying, the Virginia Guard's on their way, and the Maryland Guard's on their way, right? Well, that got my attention. I'm like, okay, what's going on in the Capitol? This is the National Capital Region. There's a lot of military here for a reason. It's the seat of government. And now we've got state-level armies coming into the Capitol.
Was there admission that Trump had given an assent or even maybe even a directive to have the Guard there that day? I mean, as reported by like Kash Patel, for instance?
That all came in the fullness of time. when finally, people like Loudermilk and Massey and these guys had a full investigation, and out came the DOD IG, statements from these individuals, Milley and these other people. Well, yeah, the president did say on January 3rd while we're in a meeting about Iran, hey, you better get 10,000 people because that's going to be a big event and we want everybody safe.
Right.
That's the president telling him on January 3rd. And instead, in the Pentagon, what you find out what happened was they tightened the deployment criteria for the DC Guard to the extent that they had no discretion to send the quick reaction force when requested by the police chief, which had been the previous operating procedure. And so it made it tougher for the Guard to deploy, not easier.
And the IG report that you're referring to revealed a couple of very interesting comments from both Milley and who was then acting SecDef Miller.
Right.
And that was a real bombshell.
Right.
Both of their responses to this.
Right.
So the president had ostensibly authorized 10,000 troops, at least the Guard itself, to be there to keep everyone safe.
Right.
But Milley basically said it's not going to happen in advance.
Yep.
And then surprisingly, Miller, we learned.
Well, he had two stories.
Right, he had the two stories. He had a story told in his book, and then he had the story that he told under oath to the committee.
That's right. Well, to actually the DOD IG, I believe.
Oh, it was IG.
And so, this whole event, people matter. Milley mattered. Milley's a character. I mean, he's full of bluster. He's a street fighter. He's a charmer. He's whatever he's got to be in charge.
But he's not a Trump guy.
Well, he told Trump he was. I've got friends that were in and around when he convinced the president he should be chief of staff, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and everybody in the Army knew he was a bad choice. He was a bad choice for chief of staff of the Army. And then we went to his, beatification up at Fort Myer, and you could watch it unfold. It was pouring rain, and instead of shortening his speech, I think he lengthened it. Right, and so you got the president, the vice president, the secretary of defense standing out in pouring rain, all the troops standing out in pouring rain while he went on and on and on, which is General Milley. And he did some other things that day that were remarkable as well. I won't get into that, but Milley was a bully, and he was a bully in the Army, and he was a bully at the Pentagon, and a bully in Chairman Joint Chiefs. And the Joint Chiefs are not the German General Staff. They do not command. It's the president, the secretary of defense, and the combatant commanders around the world, whether it's CENTCOM in the Middle East or NORTHCOM for North America. But he would routinely insert himself in that and give orders as if he commanded. And he did that several times, but that was Milley.
The rumor is that Milley despises civilian control over the military. Is that correct?
Only if it's a way to get out of trouble.
Explain that.
When I would hear from those guys, it would be, we've got a problem. We need top cover. It's time to bring in the political appointees. It wasn't that the political appointees are there representing the top official of the United States government, the president, right? These are his people throughout government, 52 in the Pentagon. I think there's a total of maybe 1,200 or something, right? And the majority of them are ambassadors or U.S. attorneys in the states. And they implement the policies that the people of America elected them to bring forward, right? And so these are his people in the agencies over the permanent government that get the permanent government to turn direction and do what the people asked when they elected this guy the president.
Right.
They didn't need that kind of help in the Pentagon. They knew what they needed to do, and it was whatever the hell they've been doing forever. And if you're in the Army, it was the forever wars, and those were good for promotions, those were good for Army relevance, those were good for the budget, and without the forever wars, you raise the question of why do we need a big Army? Right? Because you got the Navy and the Air Force over here clamoring about China, and China's is their fight, right? And only a madman would put the Army into China. And so when we would talk about great power competition, the top guy in the Army is saying, well, that's great, but I'm more worried about great service competition, right? So this is what's going on at the top of the Army, and I'm sure the other services too. And then you got this guy at the chairman of the Joint Chiefs who's maneuvering through this and in routine contact with the president, who turns on the president after the trip to St. John's Church,
right,
acting like he had no idea, right? I mean, Milley's not politically elected, not politically poised, but you don't get to be chairman of Joint Chiefs if you don't understand politics,
right?
Right? And so he's chagrined. Now he's going to resign. And now he starts showing his true colors. And he reaches out to Secretary Gates, who'd been secretary under Bush and then Obama. And that's where he got his launching pad. He had been Gates's military assistant, so his aide, essentially. Gates had flown out to his promotion at Fort Campbell when he made one-star general, and then he was off to the races. Mr. McCarthy and he got to know each other there. McCarthy, who's the Secretary of the Army, had been with Milley in the Gates office as well, and he had seen Gates move from a Republican administration to a Democrat administration. Gates had come out strongly against Trump. Gates had encouraged Milley, don't resign. Milley was making noises about resign, and he encouraged Milley, don't resign, stay in and fight him. Okay, well, that's not the job of a military officer, to stay in and fight the commander-in-chief.
Right.
Right? And this culture grew. And it grew as you got closer and closer to the election, and it became, frankly, seditious.
So Milley was not on that VTC call on January 6th, but a couple or three of his sycophants were. Is that correct? So you had McConville.
Yep.
You had
General Flynn.
Flynn. So make sure we know which Flynn we're talking about.
Charlie Flynn.
Charlie Flynn.
Yeah. And then General Walt Pyatt. Really, the problem here is the chief of staff. These two guys work for the chief of staff, chief operating officer and director of the Army staff. They're going to follow the lead. And the lead is we don't like the optics.
Right. And so that's what's coming out of the Pentagon. But over here we had General Walker, commander of the DC Guard, and he's saying we're ready to go, right?
Chomping at the bit.
Really?
Yeah, we got to go. We're ready. He had a team at Andrews, and then he had a team in the Armory, and a quick reaction force on the bus. They were ready.
Oh, they were already there.
And a good friend of mine, Earl Walker, who had been the acting general counsel of the Army, had ended up going over the White House, National Security Staff, and then he became the lawyer for the DC Guard. He was there. I mean, he knows chapter and verse what happened that day on the Guard side, and they were ready to go. They were equipped. They were properly outfitted. They knew where to go, what to do, who to meet, and they could have gone on a moment's notice.
But still, this was as a reactionary force. This was not pre-deployed to stop.
You can't send pre-deploy, really, because people criticize President Trump for why didn't you just send them? Well, it was the same criticism then of, well, why didn't you might use the Army without proper authority, right? You can't have it both ways. The Insurrection Act is triggered by certain events, and one of them is a request for support. Another is a determination that local law enforcement's overwhelmed. We're going to go through the checklist to make sure that's the case, and now I'm going to give a proclamation, desist, and go home, and now I'm going to send the Army, either Guard under federal control or the active Army, right? And he didn't have that. He needed the request for support. So he couldn't just send the Army. That would be, what they're accusing him of. So they were waiting for this request from support from the Congress or the mayor. And it finally came, but it came late. And when it got there, it was even further delayed in the Pentagon.
I had left the Capitol on January 6th to go actually look for a restroom, find a sandwich shop that was open. Both were successful. And then I did a media interview. And then I began to work my way back over to the Capitol right at dark. And just after I arrived, finally at about 5:30 p.m., we started to see the Army and Air Guard begin to arrive and circle the Capitol. Of course, by then, the tactical units from all the other three-letter agencies assisting Metro PD and Capitol Police had already successfully cleared out the building. The campus wasn't clear, but then they began to push out